In this lecture, we are going to discuss an intellectual and scientific movement that emerged in the later 19th century and really defined society and culture at the dawn of the 20th century. It created, in many ways, a social and cultural and intellectual crisis in Europe, because instead of just thinking about pre-existing ideas in a new way, it set about completely redefining reality as it had been known for millennia. And that is modernism. It can definitely be said that the 19th century was dominated by things like reason, science, and progress. The scientific revolution had led to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment had certainly fed Romanticism. Romanticism then fed into realism. Meanwhile, the exploration of the natural world continued using the scientific method and observation and empirical investigation. When you throw in the rise, spread, and success of the Industrial Revolution, what this means is that 19th century European culture very strongly embraced the idea of science, that scientific method could lead to important realizations about the natural world, could lead to important truths. And this really predominated culture in Europe. And this is why we have this enormous explosion of many different scientific fields in the 19th century leading into the 20th century, which not only changed the hard sciences, but it also contributed to the Second Industrial Revolution in particular, because whereas the First Industrial Revolution was dominated by people doing a lot of trial and error engineering and experimentation, the Second Industrial Revolution was very much based in science, scientific investigation, and then developing practical inventions that in effect proved scientific theory. What all of this means is that life in 1800 was very different than life in 1840 or 1850, and life in 1860 was also radically different than life in 1910. So it's not only that change was occurring, but the pace of change was also increasing. Life was changing so much so quickly that, as I said, someone born in, say, 1860 would never have imagined the world that they lived in every day by, say, 1910. You're talking about a complete change in transportation, a complete change in the things that they are able to purchase, the lifestyle they are able to afford further down the social scale. You're talking about electricity, both in public spaces and in the home, mass production of not just industrial goods, but also consumer goods. All of these things massively changed everything about the world around people in Europe. And yet, as I said, recall that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So much so that you can have a strong intellectual trend in a society, and eventually there's going to be some type of reaction to it. So in the mid to late 19th century, you have this embracing of science, this embracing of reason and progress. But then around the turn of the 20th century, you have in some ways a reaction to it, or it's splintering off into a new direction. And this movement involved people questioning not just the structure of religion, or not just the structure of a government, or not just how economic structures should be shaped, what type of products people should be able to buy, not just things like that. No, people started to question the very essence of the physical universe, the world around them in the most literal sense. And instead, these individuals started to appeal to the irrational. They started to take another look at human nature. And they started to question the very basis of reality and what that meant for humanity, the human experience, and even the hard sciences. Hindsight bias, unfortunately, I think, diminishes how impactful this movement was because we live in the world after all of these ideas and concepts emerged and were perpetuated. We therefore can't understand, not intrinsically, just how much these new ideas and these new trends completely changed at a very fundamental level how people thought about the world around them. And this is why there are a lot of intellectual historians, a lot of philosophers who, to some degree, argue that it was this intellectual movement that actually created the modern consciousness, that the way people fundamentally conceptualized the world before this movement was so different to the way that we do that, in effect, the past is another country. These people are not us to such an extreme degree that it's almost like a completely different culture and society. It's not our culture and society because this movement was so fundamentally transformative, such is the argument. It's even been argued that these ideas were so transformative and so completely radical to most people that it actually created a certain amount of societal confusion and societal anxiety, this sense that everything is changing, everything is shifting, and people can't quite catch their breath. They can't quite get a firm footing on the ground because everything is changing so intrinsically, so quickly, that people can't quite get a grip on it. And that created a degree of anxiety, a degree of tension in European society that people actually argue that it, at least indirectly, contributed to the outbreak of World War I. Before we can prove that type of argument, though, we have to talk about what exactly were the ideas that created the modern consciousness. What was it that people were arguing for or inventing that was so fundamentally transformative? One example would be the new frontiers in physics. Physics is about studying the natural world. It's about the fundamental mathematics of the movement and motion of everything in the world around us, from the movement of planets down to the laws that dictate the behavior and movement of atomic, if not subatomic, particles. In the 19th century and before, physics was dominated by something called classical physics, which was really pioneered by people like Isaac Newton. And it was a very stern, in a sense, very cold, hard, mathematically based, utterly rational way of looking at the natural world. These ideas had dominated for hundreds of years, if not arguably thousands, if we go back to the classical Greeks. And the vast majority of physicists agree that the laws of classical physics were true and repeatedly provable, until the late 19th century rolled around and you started to have a new wave of discoveries using new tools and new methods of experimentation that completely threw out the book of classical physics. One example of this would be the discoveries of Marie and Pierre Curie. They were two scientists who did a lot of experimentation with various elements, and they actually discovered radium. More importantly than just discovering radium, though, they also discovered that radium was within atoms, which created the idea that you don't just have atomic particles, so stuff that exists at the atomic level, but if radium is in atoms, and there are other things in atoms along with radium, That means that there are subatomic particles, which is not something that people had ever really believed could be true. People tended to believe that atoms were the smallest unit of measure, so to speak, the smallest thing that existed, and that there was really nothing below the level of atom. But when radium was discovered, this completely reshaped people's impressions of what atoms looked like and how atoms functioned. And because this completely changed the way that people understood atoms and how atoms behaved and how atoms worked, this completely changed everyone's view about physics. No longer was physics about just further understanding a science that was very abstractly linear, it was very clean, it was very hard. There were very definite rules that the natural world followed. This showed that maybe people's fundamental understanding of physics and thus the natural world that had been so long defined by natural physics, maybe that wasn't actually true. Not long after this, you have the contributions of Max Planck, who laid the groundwork for quantum theory, further exploring the fact that there were subatomic particles, or that there was something that existed that was even smaller than the atomic level, that there was a subatomic world that could actually be dictating how things interacted, both at the macro level and the micro level, not just atoms that then bounced against one another effectively, and that controlled the laws of physics and the laws of nature. And you might be saying to yourself right about now, so there's a subatomic level, not just the atomic level. Things are just a little bit smaller than people thought, right? So no big deal. The reason that this is a big deal is that people, for a very long time, had thought that atoms were at the base of everything. The smallest unit was the atom. But if this fundamental assumption in the science of physics was wrong, it opened up a Pandora's box, in essence, because if it wasn't actually true that atoms were the smallest unit, that there was a completely new and undiscovered subatomic universe to explore, if that was true and atoms weren't at the base, then what else about natural physics wasn't true? And more seriously, what else had scientists gotten wrong in their observations about the natural world that might fundamentally reshape everything we understood and had learned up until that point? If that wasn't enough of a change, then swiftly on the heels of the discoveries of Marie Curie, her husband, and Max Planck came Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein developed the theory of relativity. The theory of relativity says that time and space, and therefore reality, are not fixed, which is what classical physics argued. That time and space were fixed things. They didn't change, they didn't speed up, they didn't slow down for anything. Those were fixed elements in the universe. Einstein came along and said, nope, that's not actually true. That actually time and space, and therefore reality as people perceive it, are actually, to some degree, the product of the observer. And people at first were pretty shocked by this idea. There were a lot of people that rejected it because it just seemed to fly in the face of everything people had understood about the world and the universe, and specifically time and space and energy and those things, forever, seemingly. Yet here Einstein is saying that these quote-unquote truths that we've all agreed upon and believed in for millennia actually aren't so true. So again, fundamentally questioning things people had always assumed to be true. To be fair, Einstein's idea was not widely accepted until, I believe, 1919, when an eclipse proved that gravity was actually impacting time and space. But people did increasingly come to support Einstein's ideas before that. And this is important because, again, you're talking about fundamentally reshaping people's concept of reality, not just religion, not just political structures, not just gender roles, not just how government should function and economies should function and how people should move around, whether it be in a train or on a bicycle. This is a fundamental reshaping of physical reality. And not just that, but showing that physical reality is not the ultimate rational thing. It's not figuratively linear and fixed. Reality, it turns out, is completely irrational. What made people, arguably at least, anxious about all of these changes was that scientists, intellectuals, weren't just questioning the laws of physics, they weren't just questioning the hard sciences. There were also people that started to question fundamental assumptions about human nature and human motivation. A very famous individual who did this was an intellectual named Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche argued that this belief that Western society should rely so much on rational ideas, right? Empirical observation, scientific method, rationality, all of those things that had been championed through most of the 19th century had found their origins in the 18th century, those being a product of the scientific revolution before that. All of these ideas that had predominated, he said that that was a mistake, that relying so much on those things ignored what he felt was a fundamental truth about human nature. Because being so rational ignored things like passion and instinct. So, in a sense, Nietzsche was a romanticist in the idea that he was rejecting rationalism. But not just rationalism in terms of emotion, but we're talking about fundamental human nature here. Indeed, he argued that humans were far more often subject not to rational forces, but irrational forces. And he didn't mean irrational in the sense that people would get emotional or people would get upset, and that feeling would dominate how they acted. What Nietzsche was actually saying was that this was subconscious. It was innate, this irrationality. And things like religion, so Christianity in particular is what he was talking about because Nietzsche was an atheist. He argued that religion was actually responsible for something that he referred to pejoratively as quote-unquote slave morality. This idea that people tried to control their base biological subconscious impulses. That's actually what controlled people's behavior, Nietzsche argued. Those uncontrollable subconscious biological impulses and behaviors. Religion had stepped in, so Nietzsche argued, and tried to control people and their behavior. Religion had tried to make human nature a slave to morality, and morality was thus a construct that just worked to enslave people, to hem people in, and make them reject their baser instincts. This led him to his very famous quote, "God is dead," and by that he was saying that people needed to reject religiosity, they needed to reject the idea that they should control their impulses and instead give in to those impulses because humans are fundamentally irrational, and if we ignore that, then we are ignoring ourselves. Nietzsche, though, was a philosopher. He was not an active scientist in any way. It really was people like Sigmund Freud that took the ideas of people like Nietzsche and applied them to, let's say, applied sciences like psychology, like psychiatry. Freud developed something called psychoanalysis, where he would talk to patients and he would learn about their various behaviors and the motivations for the things they did. He was a big believer that dreams could say a lot about human wants and human desires and human actions. Overall, though, he was applying Nietzsche's ideas about the subconscious. because what Freud argued was that the human subconscious had three forces: the id, the ego, and the superego. And the id was the subconscious. That was the Nietzschean irrationality, the biological urges, these irrational, subconscious biological impulses that humans really couldn't control. Those things that, quote-unquote, slave morality that Nietzsche talked about were trying to hem in. That was the id. And Freud said that the ego and the superego, which were conscious forces, constantly worked to hem in the id, or the subconscious. So he agreed that ultimately humans were actually irrational, that humans were dominated by their subconscious urges, and those things could come out through dreams in particular. Again, was one thing he believed quite strongly in. Because Freud believed so strongly in these forces of the superego and ego trying to control the id, and the id being that thing that really controlled a lot of human behavior, he, as I said, generated psychoanalysis because he wanted to probe the subconscious. He wanted to get past the conscious and get to the subconscious and try to understand those subconscious forces, try to understand biological urges. That's why he liked dreams so much, because he was convinced that when a person was asleep and they were dreaming, the ego and the superego were really set aside because a person was, from his point of view, unconscious. Now we know when you're sleeping, you're not unconscious. But people at the time believed that when you were sleeping, you were unconscious. And so that was the time for the ego and the superego to go away, and dreams were dominated by the id. And he wanted to get at the id and understand that because he was convinced, as I've said, that that controlled human behavior. So he was very big into dream analysis and dream interpretation. While a lot of that has since been debunked, a lot of Freud's ideas have in the modern era now been debunked, people still have this fascination with dreams, this idea that dreams can help you get at what you really want or you really think, or things that are actually really important to you, and a lot of that is because of Sigmund Freud. Meanwhile, people really started to embrace Charles Darwin's idea of evolution. Although it had been very controversial when it emerged, by the late 19th century, it was by and large accepted, and other scientists had started to work with the idea. In some ways, this was good because this furthered human understanding of evolutionary forces. People took Darwin's idea and continued to advance it after Darwin himself had died. Unfortunately, though, side by side with legitimate work to further explore the concept of evolution, as often happens with a lot of scientific discoveries and developments, there were people who were very quick to misapply it. There arose an idea in the late 19th century called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism was this idea that everything about the human condition could be explained through Darwinian evolution. The strong survive, the weak don't do as well, to boil it down into its essential parts. Social Darwinism argued that some peoples in the world were more advanced or more evolved than other peoples in the world because of Darwinistic competition and competitive evolution. As you can imagine, this argument was the underpinning of a lot of incredibly offensive, incredibly misogynistic, incredibly racist ideas about disequalities that existed around the world and within various societies for various reasons. One way that social Darwinism was applied, for example, was used by racists to explain the differences in European society and colonial societies, and thus used to justify European supremacy in the colonial context. Anti-Semitism was very much wrapped up in social Darwinism, as there was this intensification of anti-Semitism in Europe in the late 19th century. There were people that used social Darwinism to justify preventing women from voting from owning property equally, from having equal access to children in the event of divorce, even allowing versus preventing legally divorce itself. Social Darwinism was applied to that. There were also eugenics societies that actually would engage in social engineering in a sense. People would form eugenics societies that people could join, and they would match people up to get married and have children based upon their physical and intellectual characteristics. The idea being that you could engineer better humans through selective breeding. So there were a lot of ways that Darwin's theory of evolution was misapplied and used to support, again, this very racist, suppressionist, marginalizing, misogynistic at times idea of social Darwinism. It was even used in the hyper-nationalist context. Remember, into the late 19th century, nationalism became incredibly intense and incredibly exclusionary. So what defined someone as being a rightful member of the nation, that classification got narrower and narrower and narrower. And a lot of times, at least depending on the place we're talking about in Europe, social Darwinism was used to justify what made someone a part of the in-group of that nationalist identity versus the out-group. So all of these ideas are working together to create a real sense of crisis in Europe. Not only can people not be assured that the physical world is what they'd always thought it was, but now maybe human nature isn't what we always thought it was. And not only is it different to what we thought, but it's even beyond our control. The idea of it being subconscious is you can't control it. So not only is the physical world now very irrational because everything's the product of the observer, so says Albert Einstein, and there's not just an atomic level, but a subatomic level that we can't see and maybe never will be able to understand. But now God is dead and humans are dictated by their subconscious, their id. You can't control the id. You can't really even get to it unless through advanced psychoanalysis. There's this misapplication, to put it mildly, of scientific ideas like evolutionary theory. Everything was changing. The 19th century in particular had been dominated by rationalism and empiricism. And now you have rationalism and empiricism produce ideas that argue that everything is not rational, that it's not empirical. So all of these fundamental truths that people had thought were true for decades, if not centuries, if not always, are now not true. And that created a real intellectual crisis in Europe at the turn of the 20th century. All of these new discoveries, these trends, these movements can be fit underneath the umbrella of modernism. And just like other movements we've talked about, there were scientific aspects to it, philosophical aspects to it, but there were also artistic aspects to it. There was and is a genre of art referred to as modernism, and there's sub-elements of it as we'll discuss. The main idea, though, is that this was people's artistic attempt to respond to the changes that were taking place and, perhaps more importantly, express how they felt about that through various visual and auditory media. If we're talking about literature, certainly the Russians are often considered to have been the paragons of modernist literature, though best at expressing all of the previous intellectual trends of romanticism and realism, but reflecting on it in a modernist way through the modernist lens. Russian authors like Leo Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, they realistically depicted events. They discussed the pitfalls of certain behaviors. One thing that Dostoevsky wrote about often was alcoholism, the negative impacts of alcoholism. Tolstoy liked to focus in particular on the negative aspects of elitism, consumerism, the hollowness potentially of living a very opulent lifestyle. So in some ways romanticizing aspects of that, but then very much realistically exploring the pitfalls of that type of lifestyle and that type of behavior. They did not shy away from the hardships of the lower classes, the difficult realities of social hierarchies, particularly in Russia during their lifetimes. They also depicted historical events accurately. Both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky wrote about historical events or created fictional stories with the background of actually occurring historical events. And at the same time, they also explored the inner psychological world of their characters, so reflecting that conscious, subconscious reflection that people like Nietzsche really championed. They wrote about characters who were experiencing hardships and didn't just talk about their behaviors and conscious motivations, but also wrote about characters that really thought about why they were acting the way they were, had inner monologues where they thought extensively about their motivations and their wants or desires, or conversely things they didn't want or didn't desire. A lot of introspection. That's pretty common in literature now. Was not particularly common then, at least to the degree that these authors wrote about it. Dostoevsky is really interesting in this context, I think, because not only was he a paragon example of a lot of these trends that I've been talking about with modernism, but also he showed how a lot of these movements that we've talked about can sometimes be umbrella terms. And it's important to understand that not everybody within the movements argued the exact same things. Dostoevsky is a really good example of that because one of the things that he liked to focus on was a lack of spiritualism, which seems very contrary to some aspects of modernism, because I just talked about Nietzsche. God is dead. Religion is just a way, from Nietzsche's point of view, to constrain the subconscious, which is what really dictated human behavior. Dostoevsky, on the other hand, a big theme in a lot of his writing was that people had embraced the rational and the materialistic so much that they had ignored the spiritual. They had ignored the religious world, that abstract spirituality that was actually really important to people, so Dostoevsky believed. And so a lot of his stories focused on people that were living very hollow lives, that had embraced consumption, had tried to construct these materialistic paradises, lived very opulently, thinking that that is what would make them happy. Turns out it wouldn't make them happy because they lacked some type of spiritual fulfillment, emotional fulfillment. A lot of his characters would then go through some type of suffering, and through that suffering, achieve salvation. The characters who refused to go through that journey or couldn't go through that journey would not achieve fulfillment in his stories. Those characters who would did achieve fulfillment in his stories, which again seems very contradictory to some other aspects of modernism, because he was saying that you have to reject the materialistic paradise and embrace the spiritual, because that's actually what's going to lead you to fulfillment. It's going to lead you to salvation. And he very strongly believed this, and that's why he focused on it quite a lot. So remember at all times that these intellectual movements are often umbrella terms, and some paragon figures of them will embrace some elements of the movements, but not others. That doesn't mean that they are any more or less modernists. It's just that modernism sometimes meant different things to different people. More than literature, though, I would say that most people are familiar with modernism, whether they realize it or not, through painting, because a lot of the artists that were active in the modernist field and then subgenres within modernism are still very popular today. Even if you don't know who painted a lot of the images, you're probably familiar with them because it was so popular and still to this day remains so very, very popular. One of those genres, so to speak, is what we call Impressionism. And Impressionists were very much determined to paint the everyday world, but the everyday world from a more visceral, emotive point of view. They embraced bright colors, they embraced dynamic brushstrokes, and they were very concentrated on bringing in the scale. So instead of painting necessarily enormous visages or just things that were very, very important, they wanted to focus on the everyday, and not the hardships necessarily of everyday, but just everyday things that people saw all the time, places that people went all the time, studying the minutiae of everyday life. Claude Monet is a very famous impressionist. He was very, very concentrated on the interplay of light, and he liked to focus on the interplay of light and water and atmosphere in particular. So a lot of his paintings include water, a lot of them include the skyline or the sky, or even the interplay between water and the sky, because he was fascinated with light and how light impacted the way that people saw things. Because remember, everything is the product of the observer, not an abstract reality that everyone sees exactly the same. Even more than Impressionism, people are familiar with Post-Impressionism, where the artist still kept the light and the color of Impressionism. So most Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painting is very bright and colorful. But they also added a tad more structure and form with the goal of expressing very subjective feeling. So you're going to paint flowers, but it's less about what the flowers look like and more about your emotional reaction to them at a very visceral level. So it's not about imitating reality. It's about personal statements, personal impressions, and one's visceral emotional reaction to the things that they are attempting to depict. Paul Cézanne and Vincent van Gogh are key examples of the post-impressionist school, Vincent van Gogh being arguably the most famous, if not the most popular artist of all time. Impressionism and post-impressionism also fed into other genres of modernist art, one of the more famous being Cubism, that was really championed by Pablo Picasso. You still have this idea of playing with light, playing with color, playing with structure and form, but very much in a cubist, literally shaped and formed way, as was often seen in most of Picasso's works. There's also the abstract art by Wassily Kandinsky is one of the most famous in this school. This idea that you're depicting in a very strong way your emotional reaction to something as opposed to attempting to realistically depict it. This is also where you start having debates about the role of the artist and the observer. So traditionally, the intent of the artist was very important, and even if the observer got something else out of it, the paramount thing, the most important thing, was what the artist was attempting to depict. But with modernism, you start to have the origin of this belief that the intention of the artist is only one part of the entire dynamic. How an observer reacts to an artistic depiction of something is incredibly important, if not just as important as what the artist was attempting to convey. In music, Impressionism and Post-Impressionism were particularly influential. You have artists that were attempting to use music to form an impressionist picture of their feelings, if not attempting to use music to create an idea of an image that they had. In other words, use their medium to musically depict an image that they wished to convey. Claude Debussy is considered one of the most important, prominent, well-known, and beloved of all of these Impressionist composers. But he was certainly not alone. Not only were there composers of music one would listen to, but there were also a lot of Impressionist composers that created operas, and they were very much concentrated on using music and using dance and using costuming and using settings to create a visceral, emotional impression of a historical story or a story that they had created in conjunction with their music. In 1913, for example, Stravinsky created an opera called The Rite of Spring. And the Rite of Spring is often used to embody the tension, the uncertainty, and just the visceral confusion that a lot of people had to all of these different strings of modernism. Reactions to the science, reactions to the psychological and psychiatric theory, reactions to the art, the complete shifting of the foundation of human understanding in Europe that then spread around the world. A lot of people look at the Rite of Spring and say that that is really a key example of that. The reason for this is because not only was the music intended to be impressionistic, evocative of emotion, and we're not talking about romantic emotion, love or hate, not that type of emotion, but visceral, subconscious, id-based impulse, almost biologically animalistic impulse was embodied in a lot of the music. This was paired with the dancing styles that were used in the Rite of Spring. Today we would just call it jazz or modern jazz movement, but opera at the time was very much dominated by either people walking around and singing out the story. If there was dance, it was virtually all ballet. In the Rite of Spring, however, there was jazz dance, as we would call it today. There were also a lot of costumes that weren't very similar to what people were used to. A lot of flowing robes, painted faces, in conjunction with more abstract setting. When you combine this with the dance people weren't used to, and the music that people weren't used to, it literally caused a riot. I'm not exaggerating. People went into this new opera excited to see it because it had been widely publicized in Paris. Stravinsky was well known and admired. So you have these people go into this opera expecting to see something they recognize and hear things they're familiar with. And they're bombarded by all of these, to them, what were very strange sights and very strange sounds. People literally did not know how to handle it, and so they started first to whistle and shout and clap at the performers. Then they started getting up and yelling things, and then there were people that were basically causing a riot outside the theater because they just could not handle this completely new thing that they really had no context to understand. Now, when we see it today, we don't necessarily think that it is that odd necessarily. It would look pretty conventional to us, in fact. At the time, it was absolutely not so. And again, people didn't really know how to handle it. And so they rioted. And that is why we can say that this less refined, this more visceral, almost biological, subconscious approach to music and to movement was so destabilizing for a lot of people. They didn't quite know how to handle it. That's why overall, a lot of people call modernism and modernist art in particular a flight from visual reality, whereas modernism in general was a flight from reality. These things that people had thought were true for decades or century or millennia were suddenly not true anymore. And that started to make people feel unsure. It created a social and cultural tension that in some places it sometimes was very, very palpable. Outside that theater in 1913 in Paris, it was very, very palpable. And that is why overall the movement has been said to have not only caused but also embodied this tension and this destabilization felt in the early part of the 20th century that at least in some way contributed to the outbreak of the First World War. When discussing modernism, sadly I think it's one of the many ways that we can see just how much hindsight bias makes it nearly impossible for us to understand how impactful and paradigm shifting all of these movements were. The scientific revolution, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, both the first and second, all of those reshaped European life at a really fundamental level. We live in the aftermath of that reshaping. So while we can learn about their impact and understand it intellectually, we can't really get it. We can't really feel it. Modernism is one of those movements. Even if you don't understand the difference between the atomic and the subatomic, or exactly how gravity impacts space and time, you today still understand that there's an entire world of germs and particles and energy and waves that we can't see. We know, even if we don't know how, that the world we see is the product, to some degree, of our brains interpreting observations and rationalizing irrational forces in various ways. These people, before this time, did not know that. In all of the other intellectual movements we've discussed, people's perception of religion or the role of religion may have changed. People's view of the role of government or the structure of government may have changed. The way that people lit their homes and saw at night might have changed. They now took bicycles, maybe cars or trains, instead of needing a horse or a horse and buggy. While all of that was very important and should not be underestimated, to some degree, all of that was the structure and the superstructure of society. Again, things that were very important, but not foundational. That seemed fixed. When modernism came through, however, both its scientists and its artists shook the substructure of reality to its very core. Things that people had thought were always one way were suddenly not that way at all. And this created widespread anxiety amongst many Europeans at the turn of the 20th century because this fundamental reconceptualization of reality was happening side by side with the acceleration of the Second Industrial Revolution, which was changing life in a material way at the same time. Everything was changing, and the anxiety this created, without a doubt, as I've said, contributed to the domestic and international tensions mounting into a new century in the face of what would be the biggest war in human history. But that is something that we will discuss another time. As always, have a good day.